So as you all just heard, the meeting has started, and we're going to start recording. Let me repeat, you're attending the Meaningful Involvement of People of Color Living with HIV, which is a webinar for the Building Leaders of Color program, BLOC, presented today by the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus in partnership with the Positive Women's Network and by NMAC. Ronald is in Houston today, which is kind of funny how heavily we are Texas. Yay! Come on. Okay, next slide. So logistics, just to go over them for a little bit. The webinar is being recorded and will be available at hivcaucus.org. Everyone in the webinar will be in attendee mode, and your phone will be muted, or your computer, however you're accessing. Feel free to ask questions in the chat box, and we are going to have time for Q&A throughout, as well as a section at the end for questions and answers, because we want to hear from you. A little bit about this webinar, next slide. This webinar is really to increase, we talk about meaningful involvement of people with HIV, but we think it's really important to look specifically at the meaningful involvement of people of color living with HIV. I think we've all recognized that as HIV has gotten browner and blacker in the US, resources have shriveled, and definitely resources that support the voices of people of color living with HIV remain scarce. And this webinar will help talk about the challenges, the history of the meaningful involvement of people with HIV, the history of people of color living with HIV in the epidemic, as well as some strategies for MIPA, what we call MIPA, meaningful involvement of people with HIV. We call it MIPA, so you're going to hear that a lot. And in specific, we're going to focus on communities of color. A little bit about us. Next slide. So these are your presenters for the day. Tiami unfortunately could not make it today. She's homesick, so we didn't want to exacerbate her being sick. I think it's always interesting to me that as people of color living with HIV, we often, even though we identify as a community living with HIV, we still don't take care of our health all the time and don't make space for it. So we're really glad that she's making space for it. But I'm going to tell you who's here and have everyone introduce themselves. I'll start with me. I'm Andy Spieldenner. I'm the vice chair of the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus, and I'm a professor at Cal State San Marcos down in Southern California. Barb?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Barb Cardell. I'm in Boulder, Colorado. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the training director for the U.S. Positive Women's Network and past vice chair of the caucus.
Teresia?
Hi, everyone. My name is Teresia Otieno. I'm based in Seattle. I work for the Center for Multicultural Health, working in the HIV program and support for immigrant and refugee populations here in Seattle.
And Teresia is also a member of the steering committee of the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus.
Sure.
Vanita Ray, we're joined with Vanita Ray, the wonderful, fabulous Vanita Ray.
Hi, everybody. My name is Vanita Ray. Strangely, I am the Deputy Director for the Positive Women's Network, USA, and I also serve on the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus Steering Committee.
I get to work with amazing people.
And just want to say I'm a woman living with HIV, and I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, we're all people living with HIV. We should have prefaced that.
Yeah.
We just assume people know. Next slide. Anita?
So I just introduced Positive Women's Network. We are involved in the Building Leaders of Color MAC program, part of the team that's been bringing these trainings out. But PWN is a national membership body of women living with HIV and allies, and our mission is to represent women living with HIV at all leadership tables to build power of women living with HIV in the US. We were founded in 2008 by a wide variety of diverse 28 women living with HIV, and have strengthened our organization over the last 10 plus years to develop a leadership pipeline and to really ensure that our needs are heard at policy level decision-making tables. And we are totally committed to racial and gender justice. And so people of color is a very important component.
Next slide. And the United States People Living with HIV Caucus, we've been around since 2010. We came, 2010 or 2009, something like that. We came about after the dissolution of the National Association of People with AIDS because we recognized there needed to be a national voice for people living with HIV in the US. And so we are a network of networks. All the national networks of people living with HIV are part of our steering committee, as well as several local and regional networks of people living with HIV, as well as independent advocates living with HIV. We strive to speak with collective voice, and we are an unincorporated association of interested parties. So we try to maintain our integrity and not, we're not trying to get into the AIDS Inc. race. We're trying to make sure that we have a constituent-led network that speaks with a collective voice. And we're one of the partners of AIDS Watch, or one of the key partners of AIDS Watch, as well as with Building Leaders of Color. Next slide. Building Leaders of Color has been a 3-year partnership between NMAC and People of Color Living with HIV networks, which have included Positively Trans, Thrive SS, Positive Women's Network, the US People Living with HIV Caucus, working with NMAC for the last 3 years to provide trainings for people of color living with HIV in order to increase leadership as well as skills in engaging planning bodies, including HIV prevention planning groups and Ryan White councils, recognizing that many of those are joint bodies at this point. And so not only did they have intensive several day long trainings, but there's also been a series of webinars that have come out to support the topics that are introduced in the trainings and to kind of get deeper into them. Next slide. Over to you, Vanita.
So, why involve people of color living with HIV in decision-making and decision-making tables? It's kind of a ludicrous question, but that's the question we're getting ready to answer. Next slide. So, what became apparent in the early days of the movement and with the rise of HIV activism, in the early days, people of color were not always seen visible or have been documented kind of in the history of HIV advocacy. And so the slogan that we all use, nothing about us without us, kind of is meaningless for those of us living with HIV who are Black or brown or people of colors, because we were not always represented at those tables. So for me, getting into HIV advocacy was one of the ways of dealing with my diagnosis, but as I got a peek into the tables, I didn't see people who looked like me. So it became apparent that things were being done without our input. So involving people of color in the movement has become a passion for me, and it's part of the caucus and PWM because to build the collective power and voice of people of color in the movement, to offer our unique perspective, needs, and focus on health equity, racial equity versus this equality kind of discussion that sometimes comes into play. So bringing our unique perspectives and backgrounds that was not currently, and it still is not currently represented at some tables. It goes without saying that we are some of the most impacted communities, and real MIPA is not race or gender neutral, so just having someone living with HIV at the table who doesn't represent the folks that are most disproportionately impacted is not real MIPA. So, there is a focus on this constituency-based voice, versus just the individuals who happen to be there. How do we bring the collective voices to the table? and bring them to the table in a meaningful way that's not just a check the box table or a table that we are there only in name or in visibility in some ways that I call the sandbox, because there's really no real outcome or purpose, or we're not really meaningful. Involvement without meaning is not involvement. So all of this represents why we need to be at the table and involved in the unique power and presence that people of color bring to the movement and why it matters. Next slide. So to talk a little bit about the benefits of involving us in all levels of decision making is because we bring the perspective closer to the ground of what's needed. People from the outside can't come in and solve the issues of our community without walking in our shoes and living our values and coming from the real connection and perspective of community. When we do the work, when we get involved, we have the chance to change the narrative around who we are and why we're here. It is not because of bad behavior. There is a systemic and structural inequity that exists that perpetuates stigma and discrimination, that when we're at the table, we get a chance to highlight. Other people cannot speak that for us. And so our involvement increases the effectiveness of any decision-making or policy or work group when we are involved not only in the decision-making, but in the implementation, not brought in after the fact. Our involvement at the beginning and throughout the process, it's what makes these kind of policies and programs effective. You know, I always tell people, if we're not at their table, we'll build our own and make it so loud that folks have to come to our table if we cannot be invited into this table or take over. And it also gives us a sense of self-empowerment and improvement in the lives of us, of people living with HIV. I got into leadership development because I wanted to motivate and uplift the voices and confidence and lanes for people of color living with HIV to be involved in the movement and to recognize that they had a right to be in a place to be there. So there are tons of benefits, not only from the decision-making, the program perspective, but from the individual perspective of what I have got to watch my fellow POC leaders do and become and be and impact is just astounding. So thank you. Next slide. So one of the other things I've had the real benefit of being a part of is a group that formed about 3 years ago. We call ourselves HIV Racial Justice Now. And we formed as a recognition that there was not a focus on, in the HIV movement, of the racial justice perspective in the implementation, solutions, and decision-making around HIV. We feel we are based on this idea that racial injustice is really the key driver of the epidemic. And so without addressing those inequities, we are really not moving forward and giving real impact into this idea of, serving folks who are living with HIV and reducing the incidence or prevalence of HIV. So one of the first things we did in recognition of this, and let me just say this, there were leaders who came before us that talked about this stuff as well. So we kind of built a framework on what other Black and Brown leaders have been bringing to the table and had brought so far, and developed something we called a Declaration of Liberation, where we began to name what racial injustice looks like and what racial justice could be. And I invite you all to take a look at this. It's our collective vision for resistance practice in the movement, grounded in the idea of racial justice and equity. So it is our assertion that any response to the impact of HIV must be rooted in the racial justice framework. You can't just talk about race when you're using data. You need to be talking about race all through the process. And to talk about these communities without saying who those communities are does a disservice to pretend like they're not Black and Brown communities. So I invite you guys to take a look at that and become a part of HIV Racial Justice Now, or follow what we're trying to do. Next slide. I hand it over to you, Andy.
Thanks. So what is MIPA? We're going to go over a little bit of the history of MIPA, and particularly around people of color being involved with MIPA. So at its most basic, MIPA means two important things. The first is recognizing the important contribution people living with or affected by HIV can make in response to the epidemic. And the second one is creating space within society for our involvement and active participation in all aspects of that response. So obviously, we're going to talk a little bit about where it started and where it's gone, but as you see, it's really about centering our voices and centering the ways that we choose to engage. Next, and I think Barb's going to handle some of the history stuff, and I'll jump in a bit.
Yeah, thanks, Andy, and thanks, Vanita. So going back to the history of MIPA, it is, we need to be really clear that meaningful involvement of people living with HIV did not spring just from the Denver Principles in 1983, that it was developed from so many predecessors that were so often communities of color that led the way around community organizing and around demanding our voices be included. And this includes the civil rights movement, as well as lessons from the farm workers' rights movement. Some feminist movements have been included as well. And so this informed really this historic response that started in 1983. And that was at a conference in Denver, Colorado. And it launched this self-empowerment movement for people living with HIV. And we like to just sort of go back and center it in that conversation because it gives us a sense of the power that we chose and that we claimed from the very, very early days. And it has been unique in a health movement to have that kind of sense of power, self-empowerment, and advocacy, as well as a demand for inclusion. So we talk about the Denver Principles, and we always say that, this statement from the Advisory Committee on People with AIDS is so powerful that we like to just include it in everything we do, because it says early on, and remember, this is 1983, so this is 35 years ago, where we say we condemn attempts to label us as victims. It's a term which implies defeat, and we are only occasionally patients. It's a term which implies passivity, helplessness, and dependence upon the care of others. We are people with AIDS, and we would say we are people with HIV today. But it is important to know that these are the roots that we come from, that it was 12 people who came from across the United States to introduce this principle in Denver, Colorado, because they did not want it to be allied with New York or San Francisco. And Denver was holding the 5th annual conference on on gay and lesbian health. And it seemed like this was an important part of the conversation. HIV had not been part of any of these conferences before. And they wrote this powerful manifesto that were outlining the rights and responsibilities of people living with HIV around our care, around how we demanded that we were treated from our medical providers, as well as the demand that we speak for ourselves. And there's the very beginning of our people first language that we still use and demand today. I'm going to go back, though, because I want to say that while the Denver Principles was a powerful, powerful beginning, this also was the powerful beginning of it being very problematic. Because as we look at this picture, we see that they are white-presenting men. And so from the very beginning of the movement, and we'll talk a little bit about how people of color have been pushed to the sides and have not been included in many of the founding histories and pictures of our movement, though they have been there from the very beginning. So we need to ensure that when we talk about the history of MIPA, that we acknowledge that white supremacy and the elevating of white voices and the elevating of white activists has been a part of our problem from the very beginning, and that we need to address that whenever we are talking about concepts like MIPA, but also talking about the history of our movement. The last little part, and MIPA is a broader conversation, and there's a lot of information that we're more than happy to share if people are interested in getting a little bit more information about meaningful involvement of people living with HIV and that historical perspective. But we always like to include the MIPA pyramid because this is about seizing power, and it is so important that when we talk about MIPA, that we start thinking about it as a structural intervention that happens in organizations as well as in our federal government around policy, funding, and programming. And so the MIPA pyramid is sort of what I call they don't want us to know. And this is about meaningful involvement of people living with HIV, and especially the meaningful involvement of people living with HIV of color, because, you know, oftentimes we see that they want us down at the bottom because it's simpler, it's easier if we're just the target audience. If our programs are decided for us, we show up, we receive the services, and we don't provide any information. As we move up the meaningful involvement sort of continuum, we become contributors. So we're consulted. We're seen as an important voice, and we have information, but we're not a part of the decision-making process. And that's where we really need to demand that as people living with HIV, and especially as people living with HIV of color, that the voices are most elevated and brought up to the top of the pyramid. We have people who are speakers, which is where your story and your expertise is honored and is shared and broadcasted. So now you have a bit of an audience and you have an opportunity to share your lessons, but oftentimes this can turn into sort of trauma porn, which is where we talk about how we acquired HIV, what our lives were like, what our challenges have been like, where we become objects. And instead of being people who are powerful decision makers and powerful people who are leaders in our communities and advocates in our communities. Then we move to the implementers, which is where we are that tier of people who see the programs and are able to make them happen because we've got connections and trust in our communities in ways that a lot of these program managers, these federal officials do not have. And so we're trading our community connections and our community expertise and our community voice for being able to help implement that in a way that we can sort of identify as important. Then we become the experts, the subject matter experts, where they want us to sit on panels and they honor our expertise and they call us the subject matter experts, persistent advocates. But in a way, it's diminishing, even though you know, we are not often included in the decision-making processes around funding and around policy decisions. So we demand, and the MIPA pyramid of demands is what I would say, you know, especially for people who with HIV of color, and as white allies, we need to demand that this happens and is implemented, is that those most impacted move up this pyramid and become the decision makers. Then that is honoring both the expertise of our lived experience, but honoring also the work that we have done to survive and to thrive. And it does demand that we move a little bit beyond traditional identifications of expertise. Some of the most amazing and impactful people that I know around advocacy who can engage an entire community do not have a piece of paper or letters after their name, but they have an incredible expertise, and so they should be elevated to that level in the decision-making pyramid. So when we talk about what's the response and how we look at it, think of this pyramid. Think about where you're at. Think about how you move up, how we demand that our communities of color and our experts of color living with HIV move up the pyramid. And also think about where you want to be, because while we talk about moving up the pyramid, you also get to choose that you do not need to be an implementer or a speaker if this is not something that resonates with you. If you need to step back and take a little bit of self-care time, you can choose to be a target audience as well. But this is about us pushing back and not allowing people to pigeonhole us. And I think with that, I turn it back to Andy.
So one of the challenges that when we talk about MIPA is really, we have to recognize kind of the history of HIV. And, you know, from the beginning, you know, people of color have had worse health outcomes than our white counterparts. And when we think about like who the leaders are, that when people talk about the leaders in HIV, you know, a lot of times they talk specifically, you know, you hear the same names, Larry Kramer, Peter Staley, Sean Strube, and these are amazing, and Charles King, these are amazing and great leaders, but they're all white cisgendered gay men. And I think that, you know, that there is a reality that we have to face, that because of the poor health outcomes and the higher mortality rates, that people of color often we passed away. And if we didn't pass away, then, you know, we burn out. It's interesting. I was just in Palm Springs and I ran into a guy, And he looked so familiar. And he used to be the executive director. He used to be the executive director, the founding executive director of the Lower East Side Harm Reduction, a Puerto Rican man. And he'd worked in HIV for decades and then just burnt out. And he ended up like reinventing himself as a doorman to a bar in Palm Springs. We have to recognize that that's real, that we burnt out, that a lot of people moved into other fields. And then we've also seen that in many HIV organizations, the commitment to BLHIV leadership has faded. And we have to acknowledge that as AIDS Inc. has turned into AIDS Inc., there have been less opportunities for people that don't have advanced degrees and don't have formalized experience specific to the organizations. There's less capacity. You know, there was a time in HIV when, you know, if you wanted to work and people were like, oh, a grant had to be written and you could write, you wrote the grant. Now they need somebody with a master's degree and all this. So there's definitely been this way in which those opportunities have shrunk for community folks. Next slide. But HIV has been historically marginalized. I want to emphasize that. What you see there is a picture in the 80s of a bunch of people of color leaders that are meeting with the then Surgeon General of the United States about HIV and people of color communities. So we've been doing this a while. But you know, we have to always contextualize, not only are we people of color living with HIV, we are doing it within a very intense kind of stigma, which wants us to be isolated and marginalized and not have power. But we have always been at the forefront of HIV efforts. Next slide. Here's some of the amazing people that have been part of community organizing around HIV. ACT UP is in the, there's a picture of ACT UP. ACT UP had its own committee of people of color that worked in ACT UP and were a powerful voice inside ACT UP. And there are lots of great leaders that came up in there, including Moises Augusto and Robert Vasquez Pacheco, who are still around. Over there, we've got the picture of the National Task Force on AIDS Prevention, an organization that was a national organization focused on gay men of color and HIV. That was from the early 90s, late 80s. I was fortunate enough to work with them. And so really wanted to bring them forward. That organization folded in 1997, obviously not because of mission success, but because economic resources weren't available. And then we have Katrina Hayslip, who was an extraordinary leader in the HIV space. Katrina was a woman of color living with HIV, a Black woman who had been incarcerated and was extraordinarily pivotal to changing CDC's definition of HIV to include women. Katrina passed away in the 90s. She was an extraordinary leader. And I bring these people forward just because I want us to really know, you know, we do have a history of being present at the forefront. And we have to remember the names of these people. Next slide. And here are people that inspired me. Craig Harris, who a Black gay man living with HIV, who forced the American Public Health Association. He walked up during their opening plenary of their huge conference and forced them to do an HIV plenary. Extraordinary public health leader. And then we've got Joe Beam, who was an artist, a Black gay writer, who really pushed the idea of Black gay men's experiences as being vital and important to record. He edited the anthology In the Life. He started the anthology Brother to Brother and could not finish it. He passed away before it was finished, and Essex Hemphill ended up finishing it. But we see that, you know, I want to bring these voices forward because I think it's important that we know that we've been there. I do want to highlight, again, I talked about the mortality. Many of the activist groups were as racially segregated as any other groups, and people of color, we created our own groups. We have organizations that rose up because a lot of the AIDS service organizations, what would become AIDS service organizations, became centering the experiences of white cisgender gay men. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, that's just what they were doing. And so when our needs weren't being met, sometimes we created our own organizations. And we've seen, again, a resurgence in the creation of networks. There's a ton of new networks opening up, which don't require 501c3 status, which don't involve a board of directors, but it's a bunch of people of color living with HIV or other kind of affinities that have come together. And if you want to see more people of color who've been involved in the battle, there's an ACT UP Oral History project where they've interviewed ACT UP members that are still alive. So you see a lot, or had been alive at the point of recording, some have since passed. But you see all the women that were involved, the women of color that were involved, the people of color that were involved, the gay men of color involved. And you start to see there's like how much we've done that goes unnoticed. Next slide. Over to you, Teresa.
Thank you so much. So when we think of MIPA and people of color, I remember and I think of an African proverb that says that the wearer of the shoe is the one that knows where it pinches most. And so as people of color, we know how we are most affected, and we've seen the benefits of involving people of color. But also we think about why are we not meaningfully involved? Why are we missing? Why are we being left behind? And I think what Andy, you've mentioned that we are dying. We are not only dying because of HIV, but also we are dying in huge numbers because of non-communicable diseases. So when you think about all that and other issues that we are facing, we find ourselves missing out or not engaging in spaces that we should be engaging. And so when you look at that slide, you see that we are dealing with racism in all aspects, in workplace, our children in school, and also wherever we are, when we live at home, it's the same issue again and again. And not even mentioning being afraid because of the police brutality. Immigration status is also another issue that people living with HIV, people of color are dealing with. Thinking myself as an immigrant person living with HIV, there's so many things that I would like to do. I would like to speak up against the current administration, the public charge, and other issues that are affecting us as people of color who are also immigrant. But I'm also afraid on how that would affect my status here. Also, we think about sexism and how that is affecting our day-to-day life. There's also the issue of cisgenderism and all the schism that really affect our meaningful engagement as people of color. So then the question of where are we, why are we not being engaged, is a compound of so many things that are affecting people of color depending on where they are, including our education privilege. Some people have not gone to school, and so when we present ourselves to some of these spaces, then our input is not taken up seriously because we don't have the numbers. We are not a doctor or a PhD holder, and that is the only thing that matters in some of these spaces, including the research. So, so in the next slide, thank you. We see that tokenism is not MIPA. And for most of us, people of color, we've seen that happen in most of the spaces that we are. So for example, being present in a meeting and not being given a space or an opportunity to vote for a subject matter that actually involves you and actually that affects you personally as a person living with HIV. The other thing that really annoys me is coming to a meeting and not even knowing the agenda of the meeting and being given that agenda at that same meeting. So you're grappling with understanding what is happening. At the same time, you want to meaningfully engage and contribute and represent, but you have not been given that opportunity. So to us as people of color, that is tokenism, and our engagement was just to tick a box that there were so many this and this number of people of color in a certain meeting. And another thing that really is common is the expectation that people of color living with HIV will always be volunteers. So when we want peer educators, when we want community mobilizers, when we want to engage communities in a certain research or even participation in research, we are expected to volunteer because at the end it is shown as if we are benefiting from the outcome. Yet the people who are doing that are getting paid, and their lives depend on that. So that imagination that we can always be volunteer, the sickness of volunteerism for people of color living with HIV is not MIPA in all senses. Another thing that really, some of the things that we feel that is not MIPA is expecting that one person, and someone mentioned that, I think it was Venita, that if you go to a meeting or if you go to a space, a forum, and you're the only person living with HIV and a person of color, that is an expectation that you represent the whole community. And I've seen that since I came here in the US, I've been to some spaces where I'm the only Black person, and the expectation is that I'll speak to all issues affecting women, affecting people of color, and I don't understand all the issues. I don't understand, for example, issues affecting African Americans in a broader way. And so it is important to ask, where are the others in the meeting? And so there are things that we can do, because we cannot only sit down and say what needs to be done. We need to take initiatives. And so in the next slide, we will talk about strategies. What are some of the things that we can do as people of color to be meaningfully engaged? What are some of the strategies that are there in place and people have used before and have worked? Next. So what can we do? Despite all the challenges, there are other places that we can be involved. And it was mentioned, like the planning councils, for example. It is important that we be meaningfully engaged. And when we say about meaningfully engaged, is being part of members of the planning council, but as well being part of the committees that make decisions, key decisions, including for funding for specific programs or projects. And the other thing is that the planning council, for example, make decisions based on data. So how are we involved in data analysis or understanding the data? How can we learn simple ways of understanding that data, or even call for getting data that is missing for people of color, so that we can increase funding to services that target people of color. The other thing is working with health service organizations and even agencies that are targeting people of color where we are living. One of the things, for example, where I work, the Center for Multicultural Health here in Seattle, is that the people who work there reflects the communities that we serve and also speak the language of the communities that we serve. And I think that is a perfect way of showing how we can involve people meaningfully by making sure we employ people from the communities that we are serving, and not just like peer educators or community mobilizers. We need to employ people in key decision making in our organizations. And we'll see some of those. And some of that is being in boards and also engaging in lobby days, including AIDS Watch. So getting involved in such engagement. Next.
Can I just add something here, Teresia? That
Sure.
yeah, I love what you're saying. I also think, you know, it's so important the point you made about bringing others, because we can't speak for all, and our goal is to have more folks of us at the table and not gatekeeping and keeping out, but helping prepare our people to be at the table. Sometimes these tables are highly technical and all this information is thrown, and you know, it's just sometimes a high learning curve. So how do we prepare people to be meaningfully engaged at these tables is really important. And I also want to say we sometimes have to challenge the exclusion when we show up at these places. And if I don't see Black gay men represented or my trans sisters represented, that I need to push back and say, what are we doing to make sure these other folks are at the table? And I don't want to leave out board of directors of health service organizations or aid service organizations that you know, sometimes have requirements for our participation, but sometimes are out of view, and we don't recognize that that's an extra place that we could be at. So just wanted to highlight a couple points.
Sure, thank you so much. And that reminds me of an incident that happened to me. I was in a meeting, and I think people could not understand my English because of my accent. And really that was uncomfortable for me. And at some point I felt as if I cannot contribute to that meeting because everyone kept on saying, I can't understand, I cannot understand. But I kept asking. I go for other meetings. I have presented at the UN, I've presented at UNAIDS meeting and other global spaces, but no one says that they don't understand. And I kind of felt as if that was intimidation because maybe I was talking too much and the issues that I was bringing were our issues. But I like what you said, Vanita. We need to call out when we see that there is unfair representation or even our issues or our input is not being incorporated in the conversation. And also, finally, we also need to look at the final document, if it's a policy document that we are contributing to, or a policy forum that we want to see change to reflect our needs as people of color. We want to follow through and see up to the final end to see where our input was incorporated. Because it is one thing to attend such forums, but also it is another thing to see the outcome of the work that we are doing. So really there is opportunity for us to engage in advocacy, in programs, in policy development, and even in research when it comes to things affecting people of color living with HIV. Next. So, and those are some of the ways that we can know if there's MIPA. And Vanita, you mentioned about board membership. And also we said about staff diversity. Do our staff reflect the people that we are serving, or the people that we are saying we represent, or the changes that we want to see in our organization? And as we said, it's not only in lower levels of employment, but also in key decision-making level or opportunities. And so also about resources as well. And it goes even to the donors themselves. We see that there's shrinking spaces for organizations, for civil society, and more so for people of color and the organizations that they're leading. So we need to call out in terms of increased funding for our work as people of color living with HIV, so that we can continue doing what we know best, representing ourselves, as well as improving the response, the HIV response. Next. Yeah, and back to Bob.
One of the things that we want to bring forward when we talk about MIPA and people of color living with HIV is that we really have to be conscious and deliberate about how we construct the spaces in which people meet. Meaningful involvement can't happen unless we feel safe to participate and encouraged to participate. And as we know, there's a lot of challenges to that, especially as people of color living with HIV. When we think of the depth and diversity of our community, some of us are put at risk in different ways than others. And it's not fair. It doesn't make it a fair playing ground, doesn't make it meaningful to be involved if people don't feel safe. So whether we're talking about people who of trans experience, whether we talk about the location of the meeting, whether we talk about the hours of the meeting, that these are all things that have to be taken into account. Who's facilitating the meeting? What are their roles? Do they know how to involve people who have substance abuse issues, or people who may not be comfortable? For instance, I don't like going to meetings in a church. That's me. I'm very uncomfortable with it. As a gay man living, a gay man of color, I have been ostracized by churches and I don't feel comfortable. So that's something to think about. Whereas other people, for instance, I work a lot in the African-American community and the Latinx community, people are very comfortable in churches in some spaces, in some regions. So you have to think about what makes the most sense, acknowledging that safe spaces sometimes make, sorry, my dog is trying to get up on the couch. Acknowledging that a safe space for some people might make other people uncomfortable. And you know, whether that's about using pronouns. I recently had the misfortune of having a fight with another academic who put in his syllabus that if you told him, if you corrected his gender, he would his gender pronouns for you, he would take points away from you as a student. And this is an African-American man, and he was telling me, like, it's crazy what they make us do. And I looked at him and I said, are you crazy? like that's a crappy thing to do to students. But it's also like, it's a violation of a lot of policies we have around gender affirmation and around sexual identity affirmation. But I was just really stunned that he had the nerve to put that in his syllabus and then double down on it. Because for him, even the being corrected about gender made him uncomfortable. But we all know that if you're not comfortable expressing your gender identity, you're not going to be involved in the classroom or the event or the space. So I think that that's something we need to think about when we talk about MIPA, is what are the ways that we can make people feel safe enough to participate and included, and recognizing that that might mean that we might be a little uncomfortable as we hold the meeting, or that other people might be uncomfortable.
Andy, can I add one thing?
Yeah, of course.
And so one of the other things about creating safe spaces is the issue around disclosure and, you know, wanting to be involved. And, you know, and you talked about the diversity and depth of our communities that we come from, whether the South, faith-based, all of this, and families, friends, it plays into the fact of whether people choose to be open or not, or feel safe enough to be open or not, and, you know, and dealing with stigma and a lot of things. So sometimes participation, folks have to make decisions around participation that's safe, whether there's ways to participate without having to disclose your status and still be at the table as an ally or something, or if you choose to, what comes with that, and really making people aware, because once it's out, there's no way to pull it back. And so that sometimes creates unsafe places for folks. So recognize that folks are navigating diversity and culture and all of these things and deciding to be involved in, and then that decision of disclosure that is not always required. There are ways to do and be involved without having to disclose, and being clear if that's the way that you want to go, and the consequences that come with that.
Great. Slide. Thanks, Veda. So there are lots of ways to build MIPA from an organizational point of view and from a funder point of view. We need to advocate that more funding and infrastructure go towards building people living with HIV networks, people of color living with HIV networks. You know, we see the positive outcome of networks, that people are able to participate, that people are able to build up their confidence. Many of the extraordinary advocates that I've met over the last 10 years are from networks, whether it's the Positive Women's Network, CIRO, people who participate in HIV is Not a Crime training academies, Thrive SS, the Reunion Project. These are all amazing. I've met extraordinary people that have just built themselves up. Some people were working in HIV and then fell out of it and then came back to it as advocates, as independent advocates. Some people are new to it, were recently diagnosed and realized that their voices weren't being heard, that they didn't see people like them, that there were people excluding them from being part of the table. And we need to push funders to have clear demonstrations of MIPA when they fund organizations. You know, I've seen over and over again that people say that they have MIPA just because they have people living with HIV advisory board that signs off on things. We need better standards to hold people accountable. And, you know, we always have to center those most impacted, people of color, you know, trans people, people who use drugs, sex workers, people who've been incarcerated. Any of the, you know, a lot of things prevent people from participating. Often they don't even know they can participate or what level they can participate at. You know, I've seen over and over again, particularly people who've been incarcerated or people who are marginalized as sex workers constantly, or people with trans experience, that they don't know how big their voice can be. They're just honored to be invited in, and being told, like, suddenly your voice is the most important one at this table, I think is extraordinarily vital. And we need to make space and hold space for those people to be able to participate.
So in all this, conversation about meaningfully involving people of color, when we start talking about this, there's a lot of pushback from white people who feel as if they are being pushed to the side or that their voice does not matter. So when we talk as white people and as allies in this movement, it is really important that we think about a couple of things. First off, we need to just stop. Just stop continuing to perpetuate the damage that has been ongoing since the beginning of our country and even before. Just stop with comments that you feel you can ask in public spaces that make people of color feel unsafe. Just stop feeling as if your voice is being decentralized, because in many spaces and in many conferences, white people feel really comfortable sharing their feelings and are not aware that for people of color who have been hearing these comments throughout the history of our movement and in every space, that we are continuing to make them feel unsafe. So if you would like to have conversations about white allyship and white supremacy, it is really great to push back to organizations. Those ones that we're elevating, that we're demanding, include people of color in ways that are meaningful. It is also a really important thing to hold those organizations responsible to have spaces where you can come and talk about this, that is facilitated by someone who is used to and accustomed to having anti-oppression conversations, anti-racism conversations, but to have these conversations in hallways where people can overhear is perpetuating the violence, and we need to just stop it. So it was very interesting. At the last HIV is Not a Crime, there was the Building United Leaders of Color, or Black United Leadership Institute, that happened before the HINAC 3. And there were a number of great plenaries that were centered around Black leadership and Black voices and the Latinx community. And some of the white allies and white people living with HIV who were there felt uncomfortable, felt like their voice was not being heard. And, we need to acknowledge that our voice has been heard a lot. Our voice has always been heard. And if we continue to mourn the fact that we don't feel heard, that we are losing the expertise of those most impacted by these decisions, and that is not okay. So I always offer on all these conversations that if you as a white person want to have an uncomfortable conversation or ask questions, call me. We also need to stop asking our Black, Latinx, and people of color, people living with HIV to teach us. We need to first do the deep learning ourselves. So we need to just stop sort of centering our comfort and centering what we feel uncomfortable. So we need to challenge white fragility amongst ourselves in our community, and we also need to demand more from our organizations. And when we get to a place where we are really elevating the leadership of our leaders of color, we will also be able to say, not here. Not here are we going to have conversations that don't involve those most impacted. Not here are we going to have a panel that is led or facilitated by a person of color when we're talking about HIV criminalizations. And we know that people who are most impacted by HIV criminalization are people of color. So we just say, not here, and just stop. And that is my challenge that I have to my white partners, is that we stand in allyship, and oftentimes standing in allyship means taking a step back.
And one of the things that's happened over and over as we've done these presentations on MIPA is really acknowledging and honoring that a lot of times people of color living with HIV, people living with HIV, we don't necessarily know that, we've accepted this kind of secondary status at many of the organizations that we get our services from or that we work with. It's always a challenge of when you're being made aware of MIPA to feel that we feel disenfranchised. And we do get frustrated by the organizations that we work with but it's important to figure out a resolution. I do want to acknowledge, there was an excellent question in the Q&A about when people speak up that there are consequences, and that sometimes people don't get invited back to meetings, they get, they get banned from organizations, people stop listening to them. And one of the solutions to that is to build community of people that you can go into meetings with. It's much harder to ignore a group of 2 or 3 people than it is to ignore one person. They can make it an individual problem then, where they just don't like you and they don't like your style. But if there's 3 people with the same messaging, it's much harder to say that. Then they know for sure that it's their problem, or they have a harder time ignoring it. So I want to acknowledge that question came in and provide some kind of response to it. Next slide. And I acknowledge the time. We are actually at time. And I wanted to acknowledge that we have about 10 or 15 minutes left, I think, in terms of slides and in terms of Q&A. So we understand if you have to hop off, but we'd appreciate it if you could stay. So with that in mind, I just wanted to say that, well, you've heard us over and over again of why people of color living with HIV participation matters, especially when it's meaningful. It makes sure that the entire community is involved with the HIV movement. We've seen over and over again organizations being okay with having 1 or 2 people of color acting as spokespeople or gatekeepers for the rest of us. And, you know, we're here to say, like, that's not okay. Like, we need to have a voice in how services are made, how policy decisions are made, how choices are made about advocacy. We see over and over again that organizations choose not to make comments, public comments about issues like immigration or criminalization because they think that it's unsafe to make comments, or it's not politically within what they want to do as an organization. And so we see that this happens, and we have to acknowledge that those issues are important to us. The immigration is incredibly important to us. HIV criminalization is incredibly important to us. How policing happens in our communities is incredibly important to us. And so we really need to think about organizations that don't center our needs. And when we have to make them acknowledge that nothing about us without us. We're people of color living with HIV. Next slide. So, we're much closer to ending than I thought. So this is the Q&A period. We'd love for you to participate using the chat box, I believe, right, Barb? Or how will they participate?
Sorry, trying to unmute myself there. Yeah, so if people want to raise their hand, we can go ahead and take you off of mute, and you can go ahead and just ask your question so that you don't have to type it in.
Okay, so here's some questions that we just wanted to know to kind of get a sense from everybody. Have you ever felt meaningfully involved in your health services, in your workplace, or your health department? And again, you know, if you want to come off mute, raise your hand. So these are just some questions that we do to the group. What about forums or meetings where you're invited? Have there been times when you've been meaningfully involved? And then we'll get to the other questions. But just, are there times when you felt like your voice really mattered, that you actually were the expert that provided the input? Tana is saying, of course, in healthcare. That's cool. So where in healthcare? With the provider, with your medical provider, or were you part of like the organization's board, or were you invited to speak at a session? It's interesting because so often, you've been part of the advisory board. That's cool. And you feel like your voice as an advisory board is heard by the executive management. That's awesome. I've been part of advisory boards where I'm like, are we just here to eat the chicken? Did you just order a pizza for us? So it's great that that you're feeling like your voice is being heard. I think that's awesome. So let's talk about the other side of it. There have been spaces where people don't feel meaningfully involved. Have there been events where you feel like your presence was tokenized or anything like that? For instance, I don't do any diversity groups at my job. Anytime they invite me to do diversity work, I'm like, nah. I'm a person of color. I know you need me for this, but I ain't doing this. This is a waste of my time because this university doesn't want to change. So I definitely stay away from that because I know I won't be meaningfully involved. So have there been spaces or events where people haven't felt meaningfully involved?
Andy, I remembered, I just remembered something that happened to me. I was in a policy forum meeting, and actually someone came and took my presentation and they wanted to change it, you know, because it had issues that affect, actually it was issues of women living with HIV, women of color. And so I had put down everything that we think, and I had consulted the community. And so the person came and said, no. We just wanted you to share about the challenges of living with HIV, what Barb was talking about, how long you've lived with HIV, how it has affected you, your family, and how you have suffered, you know, that pity thing. And I felt so bad. I really felt like I was not welcomed in that meeting. I came to tick a box and I left.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sometimes we have to leave. Sometimes we have to leave those spaces. Deidre, you have something you want to contribute?
This is Deidre from Virginia. I think one of my best examples of, I don't know if it's involved or not involved or just wow, was I actually came, I lived in Northern Virginia and I came to the Richmond area and interviewed for a couple of jobs. And after my interview, I got a call from another doctor that was opening an organization and was highly interested in having me to come to work. And her response was, I got your information because you interviewed for this other organization and they told me to call you because you are an HIV positive person that can actually put sentences together. And that was probably the most disgusting thing I had ever heard in my entire life. And to say that whether I'm a little bit or a lot or a whole bunch intelligent, that really spoke volumes to the tokenism to me. And that's how I really started to feel when I moved to Richmond and a lot of the work that I did and on a local level. And that's why I've kind of stepped back and have done more on the national level, because I am trying to bring up more folks that would be able to string sentences together that are here. But to hear that from some major folks in the area that are making major decisions was extremely disappointing.
We're all shocked. And I mean, we're not surprised because we know that happens, but you know, I'm sorry you went through that. That's terrible. And I think you've given us a great example of how you took that, like acknowledging their limitations and moving into a different advocacy space, saying, you know what, this isn't for me right here. I'm going to do something different. And I think that you've made a really smart and great decision in terms of where you input your energy, because we don't have to participate in things. That's our choice. That's meaningful involvement. So when local people are like, well, we need more people of color living with HIV on this and the epidemic plan, I'm like, yeah, you do, but it's not me.
Mm-hmm.
Not where I want to
Right.
put.
Or that, you know, please, I mean, we have some amazing chicken in Virginia. I'm going to be a little biased, but, you know, stop bringing us awesome U-Crops chicken and the sides that go along with it. And then, hey, can you bring some friends? And then it's like, well, you know, my friends are going to come, or my allies, my whoever. But at the same time, you know, don't treat them with disrespect. I'll offer them something other than a meal. Give them a gift card or give them something. I mean, I know cash is impossible, but regardless, give them something other than that fried chicken for that information.
Yeah, that's a great thing. I'm glad you brought up. There are material ways to make people meaningfully involved, you know, and we need to acknowledge that. Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you, Deidre. Anybody else? Okay. So we have a couple, this is our closing slide. If there are any questions that people have, anything else you'd like to put forward. These are ways to join the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus or the Positive Network and the Positive Women's Network USA. Many people are members of both. So if there are any questions, then we'll close out. Thank you all for being part of this. We appreciate it. And I want to thank my wonderful colleagues. Vinny had to hop off, but Teresa and Barb, thank you. And have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.